I think democracy depends on science and shared truths, and that's becoming more and more difficult now. But science itself is not and never has been very democratic. 60 years ago, I think about a third of all global R&D was funded by the US Department of Defense, which is not a very inclusive approach. It's now 3%, but the big shift, apart from to a more multipolar world, has been to business. And a relatively small number of businesses investing vast amounts in R&D, and not much engagement or accountability to the wider public. And I think this is already becoming a problem and will become more of a problem of trust for all the reasons that have been said. Now, one aspect of this is actually engaging the public in shaping the priorities of science and technology. A few countries are doing very tentative experiments. The Netherlands is a good example to involve the public, but most never even ask the public what they think should be the priorities for public spending. And in my country, a recent survey showed only 9% think publicly funded R&D benefits them, a sign of a possible problem to come. There's the whole world of citizen science and things like indigenous citizen science, which are incredibly exciting, but again, not really yet linked in to the decision-making systems. There are views that we should be involving many more people in taking part in experiments, and an emergent field of social R&D, applying the scientific method to testing out new approaches on things like elder care, early childhood, but again, they're very marginal compared to the traditional systems. So I think we have quite a big job of moving from science essentially for people to science with people, to making it more genuinely relational and essentially just applying some of the basic principles of democracy. If you don't do that, the language of inclusion will tend to be a bit of a rhetorical, cosmetic layer without all that much real substance. In relation to universities, there has been a vast expansion of universities around the world in the last 20 years, but incredible isomorphism. They nearly all have the same disciplines, same lecture halls, same length of degrees, same titles and so on, which might be good, but we don't know. And it's only very recently evidence centers have been created for higher education to even assess whether these are the optimum means of training the next generation or doing research. So there's a very big issue, which you've opened up, Rémi, but I want to just focus on one part of it closer to INGSA territory. And this is a thing which again has struck me perhaps because of my mixed background. In the past, the idea was you had scientists who advised and politicians who decided. And there was this, and we build up a very rich network of science advice to feed into governments. It crystallized for me in the spring of 2020 when I realized in my country there was very sophisticated science advice going into government, and it was somehow assumed that in Boris Johnson's brain, all of this would be synthesized into highly sophisticated actions. And it was obvious that was a ridiculous premise. And this is becoming true of so many issues as more and more of government has a high science quotient. We have to, I think, change the model. We have to have more hybrid decision-making institutions where the scientists are sharing in the responsibility for making decisions and being held to account for them. And it was very clear then, I did a study of governments around the world, none could articulate what its synthesis method was. How, when it had advice coming in on epidemiology, and mental health, and economics, and education, how do you synthesize them? No one could give a coherent answer. So we need a series of new methods and new skills, and this relates to universities, because obviously universities need to be training the next generation of scientists and engineers to be able to think more holistically, to understand ethics, to understand history, to understand the kinds of multidimensional issues which are thrown up by AI or synthetic biology or pretty much everything else. We need our universities also to play a part in retraining officials. Around the world, most officials are still primarily trained in law and economics and only have a rather dim understanding of data, statistics, science. And politicians even less. Most countries have 0 academies, 0 training for politicians. And if you don't believe me, I used to do a little test for both politicians and officials. I'd ask them, you use the internet, maybe 4, maybe 6, maybe 8 hours a day. Can you give a 3-minute lecture to a secondary school on how it works? Almost none of them could. It's magic for them. And if you ask them, how does ChatGPT work, they'll be even less likely to answer. So we have this massive capability gap as science and technology accelerate in incredibly exciting ways. And yet many of the key decision-making groups simply don't have the capabilities, the skills, the background to understand how to govern them. So I think universities have to actually experiment, they have to innovate, they have to attempt new methods of teaching, and we can go down, there's lots to talk about there. But they also need to address not just the 18 to 21 or 25-year-olds, they also need to help a rather older cohort of people exercising power actually to understand how they should be using that power to address the huge transitions of the next 5, 10, 15 years, most of which are systemic, most of which are multidimensional, most of which are complex, and yet we have education systems still stuck, even more than governments, in very anachronistic silos.